Hello and welcome to the Wire Talks. I'm Sidharth Bhatia. The Congress party is in the news mostly for the wrong reasons. After its electoral losses in 2014 and 2019, it has remained in a state of drip, unable to plan a cohesive strategy. It seems unable to even elect a new president. Recent high-profile exits, including the latest one by old-timer Ghulam Nabi Azad, has only added to the perception that the party does not know how to get out of its current confused situation. Professor Zoya Hasan has been a long-time Congress observer. A veteran political scientist, she has taught at JNU and many other institutions in India and abroad, including in Singapore and in Switzerland. She is now Professor Emerita, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and Distinguished Professor, Council for Social Development, New Delhi. Professor Hasan has authored and edited 19 books, and her latest, Ideology and Organization in Indian Politics, Polarization, and the Growing Crisis of the Congress Party, 2009 to 2019, is particularly relevant at this moment. As our guest today, we can hope that she will shed some light on the malaise that afflicts this grand old party. Professor Zoya Hasan, welcome to the Wire Talks.
Thank you very much for having me on your program. It's a pleasure.
Professor, your book comes at a particularly appropriate time. It's almost as if you timed the release to coincide with the departure of Mr. Azad. Authors die for this kind of launch. But this book must have been, and this idea must have been sometime in the making, isn't it?
Yes, the book has been in the making for the past 5 years. And over the past 10 years or so, I have done 2 books on the Congress. One, Congress After Indira, which was published by the Oxford University Press in 2012. And that was followed by another book called Agitation to Legislation, which is dealing with the Congress or the United Progressive Alliance approach to social movements, including the anti-corruption movement, which brought down the government. So this book, Ideology and Organization in Indian Politics, in a sense, is a natural culmination of the work that I have been doing. And it actually completes a trilogy, so to speak, on the Congress, because the first book deals with a period of recovery of the Congress from 2004 to 2009. And then, of course, the decline starts in 2011-12. So this book is focused on the crisis confronting the Congress that you very rightly pointed out in the beginning. So I have, as you said, been working on the Congress for a very long time. In fact, way back in 1998, I had written a book on the Congress in UP. So Congress has been a long-standing academic interest of mine.
When you write a book on current topics, current affairs, more or less, because 2009 and 2019 is, if you look at it, just 3 years back, and the effects of the second victory of the BJP are being felt at this very moment. Isn't that a kind of a problem, as it were, that you are writing about a moving target? Because the book comes out and next day something else happens. So then how do you write about it, and how do you ensure that that doesn't happen and you don't get outdated?
That's a very good question, and I think you put it very well by saying, how does one write on a moving subject, and a moving subject such as the Congress? The book deals with the period from 2009 to 19. So once you say it's from 2009 to 19, then it is dealing with that period. The developments that happened thereafter are not really a matter of great concern. But that said, it is not easy to write on the Congress party or on contemporary politics in India, largely because primary material is very hard to get. Whereas if you were writing, let us say, about the Congress in the 1950s and 60s, there's such rich and vast amounts of material available, in fact, in the Nehru Museum and library. And then there are recordings, there's just so much primary material, including minutes of the Congress Working Committee and other decision-making bodies. That is simply not the case now. One does not even know if minutes of Congress Working Committee meetings are kept, and if they are, they're certainly not available to an academic. So there is paucity of primary material, and consequently, one is dependent on interviews of leaders. Now, that too is not that easy. Congress leaders, senior Congress leaders are willing and often do give many interviews to well-known foreign scholars, but they're reluctant to do the same with Indian academics. And when they do agree to give an interview, they're very reluctant to speak, and they're unlikely to reveal anything that is not in the public domain. And so often, for some of the interviews that I did manage to do for this book, and indeed for the earlier book on Congress after Indira, most of the time they would say that this is, I should not be quoted. So in that sense, there is a real problem in writing about contemporary politics. And not surprisingly, so much of the work in Indian political science is political theory oriented and election studies. Now, election studies, which have been dominated quite rightly by the CSDS, are essentially surveys and interviews at the local level. So much of what we talk about Indian politics is essentially electoral politics. It's about elections, and there's this huge interest and obsession with elections, not just on the part of political parties, but on the part of voters and the media and so on. So our democracy is rather election oriented, and it is often now described as an electoral democracy because of the focus on elections. But for an academic, I think it is a challenge to work on political processes or political institutions or decision making between elections.
One of the negative fallouts of our obsession with elections and every action of the ruling party, every action of the opposition is seen in the light of how it will affect the election, which is often 3 or 4 years away. One of the negative fallouts is that we simply have begun to ignore, as you said, the processes, but also all the good and bad things that happen because of policy decisions. It's everything now in our minds. So have we reduced, you have said this, but I need to emphasize this, have you reduced the entire Indian democracy experiment, so to speak, to merely winning or losing? Because now people will say, for example, that everything Mr. Modi does is a masterstroke, everything Rahul Gandhi does is a waste of time, and the issues that are raised simply get ignored.
I think you're quite right. There is a great deal of emphasis on election, but at the same time, we don't want to undermine the significance of elections. I mean, Indian elections are quite extraordinary. The freeness and fairness of elections is significant. The high levels of participation, voter participation in elections, in electoral meetings, and so on is significant. In fact, it's higher than in so many Western countries. So Indian elections and India's electoral democracy is a great success story. But at the same time, what happens between elections is very, very important. And as you said, policy decisions. For example, let us say demonetization. Now, demonetization was clearly a disastrous decision. We are still living with the after effects on the economy of demonetization. Now, surely that's a very interesting subject, not just for an economist, but even for political scientists. But there is hardly any work on the politics of demonetization. What were the political compulsions, the political motivations behind demonetization, and why is it that none of what was claimed would be done by demonetization has actually happened. And there is really no interrogation of that. So likewise,
May I interrupt here to say that the demonetization came virtually on the eve of the UP election, and that has not been looked at in any serious way even today.
You're absolutely right. And, I often say to economists that clearly one would have expected demonetization to have adversely impacted the ruling party. All right, it did not do so in 2017, but there have been in UP two major elections after that, the 2019 Lok Sabha elections and then the 2022 Vidhan Sabha elections. But it doesn't look like there has been any adverse fallout of that for the ruling party. Why is this so? And I think you're absolutely right. This is such a fascinating issue waiting to be explored, but it hasn't been done. And one can think of so many policy decisions in the last 8 years, the politics of policy making, the political implications of policies, and so on. But there isn't that much work, partly because of our preoccupation with election and partly because it's not easy to get access to information on these issues, barring interviews.
One of the things that struck me is that you say that while your book is about 2009 to 19 and the headwinds that the Congress has faced, you are saying that some of the problems that have flared up now, or to put it another way, that the Congress has been facing the opposition and resistance for a very long time. And you go as far back as 1967. I'm presuming you mean the Sanyukt Vidayak Dal and the opposition unity and all that kind of thing. Could you elaborate on that for us?
Yes, I think the trials and tribulations of the Congress go back to the late 1960s. 1967 is certainly a very major turning point when, for the first time, the Congress faced an opposition challenge in several states of North India. Then 1969, the split in the Congress, and following that, the centralization in the Congress that Indira Gandhi imposed. I think the Congress has never really ever recovered from that centralization. And then, of course, the very major social and economic changes, the Green Revolution, the emergence of rich farmers in North India, who in a way were looking for alternatives to the Congress, starting with Charan Singh, and then, of course, the SVD that you just mentioned. And then, of course, the backward classes or backward castes were also very dissatisfied with the Congress because they felt that the Congress was much more focused on upper castes and Dalits and Muslims and so on, which was a coalition of extremes that the Congress had constructed. So they too were looking at alternatives. And then in the middle of all this came the Mandal decision. Yeah, and the Mandal decision was certainly a major turning point because in a way it created the conditions for a political alternative. Now, that was problematic for the Congress, but equally the upper castes who had till then been voting for the Congress were unhappy about 27% reservations, and of course the Bharatiya Janata Party too was unhappy about it. So that there was a combination of circumstances, Mandal, and then of course started the whole Rath Yatra and the Ayodhya movement, in which the Congress the Congress stand was was again very problematic. On the one hand, as far as Mandal is concerned, it had reservations about reservations. And on the other hand, when it came to the Ayodhya issue, it did open the doors for the emergence of religious politics. So in a way, the combination of centralization and some of the political compromises that the party made created problems. And then, of course, economic reforms. Economic liberalization is really a big part of the Congress story. That is to say, the Congress is the author of economic reforms and liberalization, which has led to a huge spurt in economic growth. But at the same time, it also brought in its train huge economic and social inequalities, which to some extent, and very interestingly, the Congress did address during the United Progressive Alliance government from 2004 to 2009. Thanks to the support of the left, the Congress, under Sonia Gandhi's leadership, shifted gear. Not that it gave up on neoliberalism, it would not have with Dr. Manmohan Singh as Prime Minister and the architect of economic liberalization. There was no question of giving up on that. But at the same time, there was an attempt to balance the excesses of economic liberalization. And to a great extent, they succeeded through the rights-based legislation, through welfare measures, and above all, they were able to bring a huge number of people from above the poverty line. Now, so all of this, I mean, it's a complex story of hits and misses, but in the end, what clearly did them in was the anti-corruption movement and their inability to deal with not so much their inability to deal with the corruption charges, but their inability to deal with this massive upsurge of a movement backed by Anna Hazare, but also backed by the RSS, as we now know, because so many of the important participants of that movement have noted that this movement was very much a movement, if not organized, certainly supported by the RSS. So yes, it's a complex history, but at the same time, I think developments in the period that my book is dealing with are extremely important in accounting for the precipitous decline, because the Congress decline in these past 10 years has been unprecedented. And it has suffered spectacular defeats in 2014, in 2019, and in just about most of the assembly elections that have been held between 2014 and now. So this period is not like any other period. I mean, surely crisis and decline are not new to the Congress. But I think the scale of it is certainly unprecedented.
We'll be right back after this short break. Welcome back to the Wire Talks. The anti-corruption movement that you talk about, it was kind of clear, but let's assume that it was not widely known. But there was always religious nationalism lurking in the background somewhere. And so that is the one thing to which the Congress has simply not been able to come up with a counter, because religious nationalism has only increased in the last few years. And it is this massive, backed by the massive juggernaut of money, power, of propaganda, of messaging. And when you say the Congress crisis is unprecedented, I'll frame it slightly differently to say that the Congress simply does not have an answer, a counter vision to say that, you're talking nationalism, you're talking religion as the central identity of a person, of an Indian. Well, here is what India is, and this is what we are going to work toward. It's completely confused. Why this lack of clarity on what the Congress stands for?
It is extremely interesting what you're saying, because if we were to go by the public debate on Congress decline, and there's clearly an obsession in the media about the Congress. Now, Congress decline is attributed to two principal factors. The first pertains to the ineptitude of its individual leaders, particularly the Gandhis. And second, the party organization, which is clearly in shambles. Now, I think both these are certainly important. And indeed, in this book, I give a great deal of emphasis to these factors. And the book starts with a chapter on the organizational problems and the failure to revive and renew the organization. But in the ultimate analysis, I think it is These two factors are important, but far more important, I think, is the ideological crisis that you just mentioned that confronts the Congress. That is, there is clearly a basic disagreement in the Congress in terms of how it should deal with majoritarianism. While it is certainly clearly has reservations about Hindu nationalism, but on the other hand, it is not willing to take it on frontally because it recognizes that Hindu nationalism has made an impact. It has an appeal in certain parts of the country, particularly in North India, where it has found a near permanent constituency. So I think the key issue is disagreement about an appropriate response to Hindu nationalism. And clearly, the party has swung between making ideological compromises with majoritarian nationalism and plotting a frontal battle against it. But what is clear from Congress's experience is that both as a strategy and as an actuality, the mixing of religiosity or religion with politics, in the case of the Congress, does not guarantee dividends, for the simple reason that now you have a party like the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is doing that and which is seen to be a party of the Hindu right. And therefore, whatever the Congress might do or in imitating that, it's going to be a pale imitation of the original or the real stuff, so to speak. And that's number one. And the other, which I think you also hinted at, is the related issue of nationalism. And to me, it seems that sort of Congress lost out, really, by remaining silent on the way in which nationalism was being redefined. I think the Congress rather readily ceded the nationalist space to the BJP, which now poses as the preeminent torchbearer of nationalism today, even though it made no contribution to the freedom struggle. And that's the crucible which defined Indian nationalism, from which it either absented itself or sometimes collaborated. Now, the point is that the Congress has even failed to point out that the BJP was absent from it. But look at the way in which BJP has so systematically appropriated some of the major icons of the freedom struggle, who were all Congress leaders. So, and I think that is a very big failing. Again, I think, as I point out in one of the chapters of the book, for example, on the whole issue of national security, the Congress record is pretty good, but it has not been able to communicate what they have done with regard to national security, and let us say during the whole Balakot strikes and the debate during the 2019 elections. Somewhere the Congress should have put into the public domain its own record on dealing with terrorism or dealing with national security. It hasn't been able to do so. So I think on majoritarianism and nationalism, these are the two big issues of our time in our country. The Congress doesn't really seem to have a clear position. Although I will say that now, right now, and for the last few years, I think Rahul Gandhi, to give him his due, has taken a stand and is trying to articulate an ideological counter to both majoritarian nationalism and also the other issues of economic inequalities, economic injustice, and so on and so forth. And to some extent, I think the Bharat Jodo Yatra, although it might sound like a very old-fashioned method of mobilization in the digital age, is nonetheless a significant political and ideological expression. At least it is giving expression to a certain ideological stand, focusing on unity against hate, on equity against inequity, pluralism against homogeneity. So some of this, and above all, highlighting the significance of the Constitution. So, as an embodiment, so to speak, of pluralism. So, there is now an attempt to put forward an ideological position. Now, obviously, this kind of ideological position, by definition, will be a little more loose than, let us say, Hindutva, because Hindutva has certain central ideas. Whereas if you're talking of pluralism and so on, it doesn't. It doesn't have that kind of, internal coherence that an idea such as Hindutva would have. So we will always say, find, let us say, pluralism and so on to be wanting in this regard.
At the same time, when leaders leave and they say, I do not have any kind of fixed statistics with me, that a large portion of the MLAs in the Bharatiya Janata Party at this moment are ex-congressmen and women. So clearly there is, they have value, they can win elections. Mr. Azad has left. Mr. Azad has some potential, he's never won an election in his life, but he has some potential of drawing Kashmiri Congress people and maybe voters too. So when the Bharatiya Janata Party talks about Congress Mukt Bharat, is it talking about the party or is it talking about the ideology? Or is it talking about the fact that there is still something left in the Congress, more than its MLAs even, but certainly those people, that could be potentially a problem?
I think all of the above. But among the issues that you have raised, surely Congress Mukt Bharat is about not so much about a Congress Mukt Bharat as it is about an ideology and about an idea of India. What has happened today is that Congress and many other centrist and center-left parties, which have lost out in India, as indeed elsewhere. So Congress decline is not unique. This has happened to so many parties in other parts of the world as well. But within India, I think Congress and, let us say, parties of the left, which have also declined so significantly, I think it does represent the vanishing of an idea of India and of an idea of politics, which is linked to the freedom struggle, which is linked to the legacy of the freedom movement. So certainly, Congress Mukt is not just getting rid of a party, which of course is very much on their agenda, because they can see the Congress as the only all-India alternative, no matter how well the TMC might do in Bengal and how well TRS might do in Telangana and so on, or for that matter, even Arvind Kejriwal and Aam Aadmi Party might do well in, let us say, or better in Gujarat and Himachal. But the fact of the matter is that these are all essentially, with the exception of our state-based parties, they are regional parties. They are very important, but they are not really, they are not a substitute for an all India party, which can become the nodal point of opposition. So that is certainly is a factor. And thirdly, I think it also is an attempt, clearly, to build a one-party state. And this one-party state is something which seems to be, one everything. And within that, you have one-party state as well, which is very much an agenda of authoritarian governments and authoritarian parties. And surely the present dispensation is fairly authoritarian in its functioning. And interestingly, it's not just Congress Mukt, but also opposition Mukt, because as the BJP is making forays into South India, it surely knows that it faces major opposition from regional parties there. So I think there is a certain opposition to pluralism, to political pluralism, and the idea that that BJP alone can provide the kind of governance that India needs.
Do you think that these departures, which the media loves, Azad, before that Scindia, even RP Singh, though many of those people who left were mostly media high profile in the media, but not necessarily, did not have a mass base. Do you think that they are a symptom or a cause? And secondly, will they really seriously impact the Congress at the end of the day? I mean, Mr. Azad's going, how does it really matter in the larger scheme of things?
There's one issue which I ought to have mentioned earlier, and that is that, Congress is a classic governmental party, and it had been in power for so long, for 52 years at the center, and perhaps many more in many states. So as a governmental party, most leaders of the Congress are principally interested in power and pelf. They're interested in positions. And many of those who have left the Congress have done so not for ideological reasons, not because they have problems with the Congress ideology or Congress politics. They may have problems with the top leadership, and many of them have indeed complained that they have not been able to get access to Rahul Gandhi, that they're trying to make appointments and they've had to wait for months and so on, and have not been able to meet him. So yes, some of them do have those complaints. But really speaking, they have left the Congress because they do not see the prospect of getting the kind of ministerial positions or winning elections in states. And so many of them want Rajya Sabha seats. In fact, one of the major problems with the Congress organization and the Congress party is that it has been dominated by Rajya Sabha members. And these Rajya Sabha members are basically based in Delhi. They are not mass leaders. They do not really engage with the hurly-burly of politics in the states or in the local areas. So I think most of those who have left for greener pastures. This is true of just about all the names you have mentioned. Some of the bigger names that you mentioned have indeed been accommodated in the BJP. The only one so far of those who have left, and who's perhaps the most important, is Ghulam Nabi Azad, notwithstanding that he has never won an election. But the fact that he's from Kashmir, and the fact that there are areas where he can perhaps mobilize some support, although very many people say that his support is very limited to certain parts of Jammu, not even much support in the Kashmir Valley. But the fact is that the BJP is looking for an acceptable face, and he might well be someone that they might bank upon as the chief minister. So I think Ghulam Nabi Azad's case is somewhat exceptional, but it must be said that if there is anyone who has been a beneficiary of Congress patronage and of the patronage of the Gandhis, I can't think of anyone who can really compete with Ghulam Nabi Azad. And after all, he was part of the core group. He was part of the core decision making. So what is he talking about? He's talking about decisions that he was consulted on, that he was part of. And I have heard in the course of some of the interviews that I've done for this book, and this was much before his departure, that he was among the leaders who was not very keen on elections to the Congress Working Committee or even presidential election. But he's not the only one, to be fair. Most senior leaders have been wary of internal elections because they do not want to really upset the status quo. So, and once the Congress was weakened, I think some of these leaders, in fact, made the argument that now that Congress is in opposition, if we have elections, it's really going to, sort of upset the internal balance in the party. So the point is that many of these leaders, including Ghulam Nabi Azad, and some of them who are part of the famous G23, are essentially leaders without a very significant mass base, and have been completely dependent on the largesse of the top leadership. And now, of course, they're complaining about that very leadership, which is responsible for their success. But in a way, we can't blame just the leaders. We have to also blame the top leadership, including the Gandhis, who patronized, supported, promoted these leaders who have now turned against them.
Which smoothly brings me to the point I was going to raise next, is that despite all this protestations of the G23 and a whole lot of others who are not in G23 but are watching from the sidelines, none of them has seen fit to go out on the streets with Rahul Gandhi all this while. None of them are on Bharat Jodo campaign, and none of them want to get their hands dirty. That could be partly because they have no mass base, but at least they can be part of an entourage or part of some movement or part of some effort that the much maligned Rahul Gandhi is doing. Or say to him that, we'll be with you, we will in fact be ahead of you. So they want to have it the easy way. And isn't that really a problem? Because these are the people with experience and they are the people who are well known in the media, and it will certainly help if they take part in these things, wouldn't it?
I think that's an excellent point, Sidharth, that none of these leaders of G23 and many others who are sympathetic to them have really engaged in any street politics. While they might complain about the failure of the Congress to connect with people, or that Rahul Gandhi doesn't have a connect, and so on and so forth. But what about them? Surely during the pandemic, they could not have gone out on the streets, but the pandemic has now been over for several months. And none of these leaders are known to have participated in any major movements. And for example, Bharat Jodo is a very major initiative. Whether it will be effective and whether this will actually translate into electoral support remains to be seen. But nonetheless, it is an attempt to connect the party to the people. It is an attempt to connect the party to civil society. And what is interesting, one has observed over the past 5 or 6 days, is that there is a very large number of civil society organizations who, despite their reservations about the Congress, who have never supported the Congress party, are nonetheless appreciating this initiative and are backing the Bharat Jodo Yatra. Most notable among them is, of course, Yogendra Yadav and many others who have decided to set aside everything else and sort of go along with the Bharat Jodo Yatra. But are there very many of these G23 leaders or many of these Congress leaders who have a litany of complaints about the top leadership? They're not really quite in the forefront of this Bharat Jodo Yatra or the several other campaigns. Public campaigns that the Congress has launched, for example, against price rise, the recent rally in Ramlila Maidan. Again, an important initiative. So you're absolutely right that there is nothing stopping them from participating in these protests. But the point is that what they want is power on a platter. And that power on a platter is not coming their way simply because the Congress is at the moment really down and out and is not really in a position to offer them positions or Rajya Sabha memberships because it is in power in so few states.
So I'll pare it down to the question that constantly anchors and social media commentators and drawing rooms constantly talk about. The Gandhis must leave, all will be well. Do you think the Gandhis leaving the Congress, not the leadership of the Congress, but the Congress itself perhaps, and sitting at home, will really galvanize the Congress?
Well, that's a very important question, and clearly that's a question on just about everyone's mind, and above all in the media's mind. It cannot stop talking about that. Well, I think it is hard to say at this stage whether Gandhi's leaving the Congress or leaving the leadership of the Congress would help the party or not. Because I think to think that leadership can make such a big difference is to completely ignore the context, the social and political context that we are functioning in. And also, it is not taking into account the very unequal playing field between the ruling party and the opposition, or between the BJP and the opposition. After all, this combination of money, power, media, and the RSS organization that is at the disposal of the ruling party, and of course, Mr. Narendra Modi and his popularity. I mean, the fact is that he is very popular, notwithstanding that he may not have delivered on some of the major promises, but he remains popular, and that itself is a fascinating issue as to why he's still so popular. But he is so, and people in India seem to want a strong man, and he, of course, comes across as a very strong and decisive leader. So it's an unequal playing field, no matter who is helming the Congress or the opposition. It is a tough battle because it's an unequal battle. But that said, perhaps a non-Gandhi as the leader is something that the Congress can try. And it looks like that might well happen, because Rahul Gandhi has made it clear that he is not going to be contesting the presidential elections. But I think it is going to create a complicated situation, because the Gandhis he may not be the president. Sonia Gandhi might not be the president, but the Gandhis are not going away anywhere. So it's not as though they're going to, they may not take the presidentship, but they're not retiring from politics. And therefore, that creates an even more complicated situation, where you will have a president, and yet you will have Rahul Gandhi, who's leading the Bharat Jodo Yatra, as the most important leader. So it is altogether a difficult situation. Also, I think there's something else that is also important. Whether we like it or not, and whether the media likes it or not, the fact is that the majority of people in the Congress are not averse to the Gandhis. They look upon the Gandhis as a glue that unites the party. So in that sense, you can't really wish away the Gandhis. But at the same time, it's very clear that dynastic leadership is a no-go in India right now. And also this whole propaganda and campaign against the Gandhis has to some extent had an impact. So perhaps stepping away from leadership might well help the Gandhis. Whether it will help the Congress or not is something that is difficult to predict at this stage.
Yeah, I think your contextual answer just explains a lot of things, that basically whoever takes over will still have to face those monumental problems, or this juggernaut which has organization, media, and cash at its disposal, and of course is in power.
And is a master of this whole digital technology.
All of that.
Money, power, and electoral bonds. I think electoral bonds is so important. And as we can see, chief justices are coming and going, and none of them is really taking up the case of electoral bonds, which
I think
more important than even the abolition of Article 370 or CAA. Of the three issues which are pending in the Supreme Court, I consider the electoral bonds the most important, because that is responsible for the uneven playing field. And that is what is really the challenge before Indian electoral bonds are undermining Indian democracy.
No. So at some stage, I'm hoping to talk to somebody about our justice situation at this moment, and all of this will come there. So finally, we touched upon Congress Mukt Bharat, we talked upon the Gandhis, we touched upon all of that, and you have your conclusion says the idea of a liberal centrist party as the opposition is critical in this country. So, but you also make a point, and that's a good way to bring it all together, what you've been saying. It still has 19% of the national vote, and it has a presence all over the country, and certainly going by a tiny kind of sample of people on social media who are articulate and who support it and are not Congress members. It does have, it's not without its adherents or without its followers. It's not as if it's lost elections. Maybe it will tomorrow not be in a single state, but it does not mean that the idea of the Congress has vanished. How do you then move from there? A, and second, most important, what does that 19% signify?
I think you've put it quite well. I think the idea of the Congress has diminished, but it has not vanished. And it has not vanished because, as you said, they even in 2019, the Congress won about a little over 19% of the vote. And when you compare that with the vote of other opposition parties like the Aam Aadmi Party, which is hoping to displace the Congress and so on. So yes, it's a very significant, and above all, Congress has a footprint across the country, across several states. I think where the Congress has really lost out is in UP and Bihar. These two states which are very large states and which account for something like 120, 125 seats. The Congress has diminished so hugely, and that is part of the problem. But what does this signify? I think it signifies to me that it actually represents, in a certain sense, certain ideas which are. The whole focus on unity, on pluralism. I think some of these issues, and even to some extent, ideas of justice, I think that is what it represents. But at this moment, I think this suggests that there's a very large section of people in India, a very large section of the electorate, which is certainly committed to these ideas and which is committed to constitutional democracy. I think what this 20% vote represents is a support for constitutional democracy, and I think that's what is important, and it is worth preserving because the whole ideological point of the story that we are discussing is that the diminishing of the Congress, whether we agree with it or not, is in a sense a diminishing of the substance of politics. And so it is disconcerting, not only for the Congress, but it is harmful for democracy. And it is therefore important to push back against that. Now, whether Congress will be able to do so or not remains to be seen, because it is a very difficult situation. While we can blame the opposition and we can go on saying, well, there's no opposition, but the fact of the matter is that when you have money power and media power, and between the two, I'm increasingly convinced that media power seems to matter even more. And if the media is as one-sided as it is now, it does make it very, very difficult for any opposition to take on the BJP.
Yes, as we discussed in the beginning, this is a moving story. But in any case, I think I take away a lot of interesting points from your explanation and analysis. One of them being that a one-party state is not something that Indians have known or countenance or will countenance, I hope. And that the Constitution is critical, and the Constitution is not merely critical for upholding minority rights, which is crucial, but it's also because it talks about rights. It talks about duties, which the BJP is now emphasizing, but it talks about dignity to every Indian. And just for that sake, the idea of regional parties fighting the BJP, the idea of the Congress resisting total onslaught is important for not those parties alone, but for the whole notion of what democratic India stands for. So I think your book has really contributed to the debate. It's a book which I read, by the way, before meeting you. I was quite fascinated, and I kept on thinking, why is she like a journalist writing on current topics? And and it'll change tomorrow. But this is a historical kind of document that we will refer to. I hope there will be more moments in the future when books on contemporary India keep coming out. So for that, thank you, Professor Hasan, for enlightening us to what not just the Congress's dilemmas are, but also how they impact upon a wider Indian society and India as a whole. That was Professor Zoya Hasan, who is one of our most distinguished political scientists, talking about her latest book on the Congress between 2009 and 2019. We will be back next week with another guest. Till then, from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and the rest of the Wire Talks team, goodbye.
Thank you very much, Sidharth. It was a great pleasure to talk about India's democratic dilemmas. Thank you.
You can check out this podcast and other interesting ones on the Wire website, the IVM Podcasts website, app, or wherever else that you get your podcasts. Goodbye from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and the Wire Talks podcast team.